November 3rd, 1989, crowds of people demolished the Berlin Wall. The Soviet Empire had finally collapsed. The world, or at least a big part of it, joined in the celebration and promised to help reform the old communist system. The grim reality of the post-communist transition hit hard and fast. Freedom came with a new form of modern slavery, human trafficking. Human trafficking involves the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Every year, between 20,000 and 60,000 Russian women become victims of traffickers, and no less than 500,000 have been trafficked from the country since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia has become one of the largest exporters of women for the sex industry, and also provides multiple transit routes for human traffickers from the poorer countries of the former Soviet Union. The Russian government declared the trafficking of people a threat to national security in 2004. By then, a number of NGOs, along with some scholars and a representative from the Duma, pushed for a change in the Russian criminal legislation to include an anti-trafficking law. The collapse of the Soviet regime and the economic shock that hit the former communist countries resulted in the immediate deterioration of the living standard among the general population. Women, however, suffered more severe economic consequences than men. Unemployment, previously non-existent under communism, was much higher in the female labor force. Many women were lured into trafficking by the promise of a well-paid job. Also, the absence of a functional legal system played a substantial role in the rise of human trafficking. Although the communist regimes fell almost overnight, the old legal systems were not rapidly replaced. The emerging Russian democracy inherited most of its criminal laws from the former Soviet legal code, where human trafficking was not prohibited or even defined. The old Soviet system had laws against rape and kidnapping, but no laws for domestic abuse or other broad prohibitions that could be used to prosecute trafficking. Domestic violence, when reported, was prosecuted under the article hooliganism. Thus, human trafficking victims could expect very little legal protection from traffickers unless they were raped or kidnapped. It took over a decade after independence to introduce a law specifically targeted at trafficking. Further, corruption is rampant across the political and governmental institutions of Russia. Obtaining forged documents or crossing the Russian border takes no more than a bribe. Corruption makes the job of a trafficker much easier and less risky. In recent years, Russia has become one of the largest exporters in the human trade and a major transit route for human trafficking between Asia and Europe. Little notable progress in combating human trafficking was visible until the early 2000s. Until 2001, the key actors in the fight against human trafficking in Russia were international and non-governmental organizations. On December 12, 2000, the Russian President Vladimir Putin signed the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and its supplemental protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. The protocol, also called the Palermo Protocol, is a wide-ranging international agreement to address the crime of trafficking in persons, especially women and children, on a transnational level. It focuses specifically on the illegal trade in human beings for the purpose of exploitation of labor, prostitution, and other sexual services, domestic servitude, slavery, and the removal of organs. The Russian government ratification of the protocol was its first major international step in combating human trafficking. In December 2003, President Vladimir Putin, in response to international treaty commitments and international pressure, amended the Russian Criminal Code. Article 127.1 on trafficking in persons and Article 127.2 on use of slave labor were introduced into the Criminal Code by Law Number 162, which ultimately declared that human trafficking was punishable by prison term. The Russian Code here defined human trafficking as the buying, selling of persons, or other actions committed by the purpose of such persons' exploitation in the form of recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of such person. Following the passage of Law 162, draft legislation was submitted in 2003 calling for Commission to combat the trade in human beings, although it was never passed after it was introduced at a preliminary hearing in the Duma. Although Russia has the legislation under which human trafficking crimes can be prosecuted, according to the U.S. Department of State, in 2008, police conducted 111 trafficking investigations under Article 127 for sex trafficking and 16 for forced labor cases, down from the 139 trafficking investigations in 2007. It was difficult to ascertain the exact number of prosecutions and convictions resulting from these investigations because the government again did not collect and maintain such statistics. At least 9 traffickers were prosecuted during the reporting period, compared with at least 46 prosecutions in 2007. The government did not report the number of convicted traffickers or those sentenced to serve time in prison during the reporting period. In July 2006, the Duma passed asset for forfeiture legislation that permits prosecutors to forfeit assets of convicted persons, including traffickers. However, there were no reports that the law had been used against human traffickers since its enactment. In addition to its weak prosecution efforts regarding human trafficking, the federal government also falls short in its effort to provide assistance to trafficking victims. According to the U.S. Department of State, Russia demonstrated little progress in improving its inadequate efforts to protect and assist victims during the reporting period. Russia lacks national policies and national programs to provide victims with assistance. The U.S. Department of State describes Russian government efforts at human trafficking prevention as modest. This demonstrates that although the government is taking steps to prevent human trafficking through awareness campaigns, it needs to make significant efforts to reduce the demand for trafficked persons in all sectors. In 2013, the U.S. State Department's annual Trafficking Persons Report downgraded Russia from its Tier 2 watch list to its lowest classification of Tier 3. This means that, in the eyes of the State Department, Russia is not sufficiently meeting anti-trafficking standards. The 2013 TIP report talks of Russia's minimal progress in efforts to protect and assist trafficking victims, its limited efforts to prevent trafficking, and its lack of effort to reduce the demand for commercial sex acts.